late February 1945, Elsdorf, Rhineland. The T-26E3 heavy tank, designated Fireball, sat silhouetted against burning buildings, its 46-ton mass blocking a critical crossroad in the shattered German town. Inside, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik and his crew maintained overwatch, scanning for German armor they knew operated in the sector. The Pershing had been in combat less than a week, among only 20 such tanks in all of Europe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From 100 yards away, hidden in rubble and debris, a Tiger tank commander observed through his optics. He had fought for 3 years across Russia, North Africa, and now this final defense of the fatherland. He recognized American tank silhouettes instantly. Sherman, Grant, Stuart. This vehicle was different. Larger turret, heavier hull, lower profile than the tall Shermans. The long gun barrel extending from that massive turret spoke of firepower his intelligence briefings had warned about but he had never encountered. The Tiger fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first 88mm round penetrated Fireball's turret through the machine gun port in the mantlet, killing both gunner and loader instantly. The second shot struck the gun barrel, detonating a round in the chamber and distorting the barrel. The third glanced off the turret side, tearing away the upper cupola hatch. Mashlonik's crew bailed out. The Tiger began backing away to escape before American artillery could respond, but entangled itself in debris. The crew abandoned their vehicle rather than risk capture. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Both tanks sat immobile in Elsdorf that cold February morning. Fireball would be recovered, repaired, and returned to combat within 10 days. The Tiger remained where its crew left it, another addition to the thousands of German armoured vehicles abandoned across a collapsing Reich. The encounter revealed something German tankers and engineers were beginning to understand with growing alarm. America had finally fielded a tank that could meet German heavy armour on equal terms, mounting a gun comparable to their fearsome 88mm, protected by armour thick enough to survive hits that would destroy a Sherman. The mathematics of armoured warfare on the Western Front were being rewritten in February and March of 1945. Not through any captured vehicle German engineers could test at leisure like the Sherman tanks they had analysed at Kummersdorf proving grounds, but through desperate battlefield encounters that demonstrated American industrial capacity had produced something German commanders had not believed possible. A tank combining firepower, protection, and reliability in quantities that would overwhelm German defensive positions already collapsing from fuel, starvation, ammunition shortages, and the systematic destruction of German logistics by Allied air power. This is not the story of a captured Pershing tank shipped to Germany for evaluation. No such capture occurred. Germany was dying too quickly, its armies in headlong retreat, its testing facilities evacuating ahead of Allied advances. Instead, this is the story of what German tankers, engineers, and intelligence officers learned about the T-26E3 through the only laboratory still available to them in early 1945, the battlefield itself. German intelligence had tracked American heavy tank development since mid-1943. Reports from Abwehr agents, interrogations of captured American personnel, and photographic reconnaissance revealed that the United States was developing successors to the Sherman. Technical intelligence summaries circulated through Heereswaffenamt headquarters, documented American experimentation with heavier armor, more powerful guns, and new suspension systems. By November 1944, German intelligence possessed reasonably accurate information about American tank development programs. They knew the Americans designated their new heavy tanks in the T-20 through T-26 series. They understood these vehicles would mount 90mm guns, comparable in performance to the German 88mm KWK-36 used on Tiger tanks. They estimated armor protection would significantly exceed Sherman standards, though specific thickness measurements remained uncertain. What German intelligence could not determine with certainty was whether these tanks would reach combat in significant numbers before Germany's military collapse. American production capacity was known to be enormous, Sherman production exceeded German total tank output of all types, but developing a completely new tank design, deploying it across the Atlantic while maintaining Sherman production was a massive undertaking. German strategic planners hoped that bureaucratic delays, technical problems, and the challenges of training crews and establishing maintenance infrastructure would prevent the new American heavy tanks from reaching combat in time to affect the war's outcome. December 1944 destroyed these hopes. The German offensive in the Ardennes, later called the Battle of the Bulge, revealed Sherman limitations against concentrated German armor more dramatically than any previous engagement. American tank losses mounted catastrophically as Panthers and Tigers engaged Sherman-equipped units in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. After action reports from American armored divisions documented the stark firepower and protection disadvantage Sherman crews faced against German heavy tanks. Within the German command structure, some officers viewed the Battle of the Bulge as validation of their tank development philosophy. Tigers and Panthers, despite their mechanical complexity and fuel consumption problems, dominated individual tank engagements. If Germany could maintain these qualitative advantages while defending on interior lines with shorter supply routes, perhaps the Western Allies could be held at the Rhine through spring, while resources were concentrated against the Soviet advance from the east. This strategic calculation depended on the Sherman remaining America's primary battle tank. Intelligence assessments in December 1944 suggested the new American heavy tanks would not reach Europe until late spring at the earliest, possibly summer of 1945. By then, Germany hoped to have stabilized defensive lines or negotiated a separate peace with the Western powers against the common Soviet threat. On December 22, 1944, 4 days after German forces achieved maximum penetration into American lines during the Ardennes offensive, the United States War Department made a critical decision. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, ordered immediate deployment of available T-26E3 tanks to Europe without awaiting completion of standard testing protocols. The Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated unacceptable American tank casualties. The new heavy tanks would deploy immediately, teething problems and all. 20 T-26E3 tanks, the first produced at Fisher Tank Arsenal between November and December 1944, were crated and loaded aboard transport ships at American Atlantic ports in late December and early January. These vehicles represented the entire combat-ready inventory. Another 70 tanks were in production, but not yet completed. The 20 that shipped to Europe would be the only Pershings to see combat in World War II, though hundreds more would arrive after Germany's surrender. The tanks arrived at the Belgian port of Antwerp in mid-January 1945. They were distributed to Major General Maurice Rose's 3rd Armoured Division and Major General John Leonard's 9th Armoured Division, both part of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army. The 3rd Armoured received 10 tanks. The 9th Armoured received 10 tanks. Each division formed them into provisional platoons attached to existing tank companies. Personnel from the Zebra Technical Mission accompanied the tanks. This specialized unit, led by Brigadier General Gladion Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance, included engineers, maintenance specialists, and technical observers tasked with supporting the T-26E3s in combat and documenting their performance. The mission reflected Army Ordnance's recognition that these tanks were entering combat with incomplete testing, potential mechanical problems, and crews who had received minimal training on the new type. The T-26E3 represented a radical departure from previous American tank design, where the Sherman inherited its basic layout from the M3 Grant medium tank of 1941, which in turn derived from design principles dating to the 1932. The T-26 series embodied completely new engineering philosophy. The Sherman employed front-mounted transmission requiring a drive shaft running the length of the hull, creating the Sherman's characteristic tall profile. The T-26 used rear-mounted transmission with engine and drivetrain in the rear hull, allowing a lower silhouette and better armor angles. The Sherman used vertical volute spring suspension inherited from agricultural tractor design. The T-26 employed torsion bar suspension, providing superior ride quality and ground clearance. The Sherman mounted its main gun in a turret ring derived from the original M3 Grant design, limiting potential upgrades. The T-26 featured a massive cast turret with exceptionally large turret ring diameter, providing substantial growth potential for future armament upgrades. Most critically, the T-26 mounted the 90mm M3 gun, in a configuration that matched or exceeded the capabilities of the German 88mm guns that had dominated armoured warfare since Tigers entered combat in late 1942. The M3 90mm fired armour-piercing rounds at muzzle velocities exceeding 800 meters per second, capable of penetrating 195mm of armour at 1,000 meters range. This gave the T-26E3 ability to engage and defeat Tiger tanks at ranges where Tigers could reply effectively, eliminating the Sherman's critical disadvantage of requiring close-range flank shots to defeat German heavy armour. The T-26E3 weighed 46 tons in combat configuration, substantially heavier than the 33-ton Sherman, but lighter than the 57-ton Tiger or 45-ton Panther. Armour protection featured 100mm thick frontal glacis plate angled at 46 degrees, providing effective protection against most German anti-tank weapons at typical combat ranges. The turret front measured 100mm, with the gun mantlet varying from 120 to 180mm, making the T-26E3 effectively immune to frontal penetration by anything except the most powerful German guns at close range. Power came from the Ford GAF V8 gasoline engine, producing 500 horsepower. This was the same basic engine used in the M4A3 Sherman, but the T-26E3 weighed 13 tons more than the M4A3. The result was predictable. The T-26E3 was underpowered, achieving maximum road speed of only 30 km per hour compared to 48 km per hour for the Sherman. Cross-country performance suffered similarly. American tankers quickly learned that the Pershing, as it would be officially named in March 1945, combined heavy tank firepower and protection with medium tank mobility limitations. German intelligence first confirmed American heavy tank deployment through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations in late January 1945. Interrogation reports from American prisoners captured during fighting around the Ruhr River mentioned new heavy tanks with 90mm guns recently issued to their divisions. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights photographed unusual tank silhouettes near American forward positions, though poor weather and limited flight operations made comprehensive photo intelligence impossible. By early February, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued intelligence bulletins to German units fighting on the Western Front. The bulletins warned that American forces had deployed small numbers of new heavy tanks, designated T-26 or possibly M-26. These vehicles mounted 90mm high-velocity guns capable of penetrating Tiger frontal armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Armour protection equaled or exceeded Tiger standards frontally. The vehicles were present in very limited numbers, probably fewer than 50 across the entire Western Front. The intelligence assessment concluded that while these new American tanks posed significant tactical threat in direct engagement, their limited numbers meant they could not affect operational or strategic outcomes. German commanders should expect to encounter them occasionally, employ appropriate countermeasures, but not regard them as game-changing weapons given their scarcity. This assessment would prove accurate for the final 3 months of the war in Europe. 20 T-26E3 tanks could not decide campaigns or influence strategic outcomes when Germany still fielded hundreds of Panthers and dozens of Tigers, despite catastrophic losses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But those 20 tanks could and would teach German tankers painful lessons about American engineering capabilities and industrial potential. Each encounter provided data points that collectively demonstrated what Germany had feared since American entry into the war. American industry, when fully mobilized and properly directed, could produce weapons matching or exceeding German capabilities while maintaining production volumes Germany could never approach. The T-26E3 tanks entered combat in late February 1945 during operations along the Ruhr River in the Rhineland. This was the beginning of the final Allied offensive to cross the Rhine, encircle German forces in the Ruhr industrial region, and drive into central Germany. German forces fought with characteristic skill and determination, but lacked the resources to sustain defensive positions against Allied material superiority and overwhelming air power. On February 26th, a T-26E3 from Company F, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division, engaged and destroyed a Panzer IV at Elsdorf. This was the first confirmed kill by a Pershing in combat. The 90mm gun penetrated the Panzer IV's frontal armour at approximately 800 metres range, demonstrating the massive firepower advantage over the Sherman's 75 or 76mm guns. The Panzer IV crew never reached effective range to reply before their vehicle was destroyed. The following day, February 27th, came the engagement at Elsdorf, involving Sergeant Mashlonik's Fireball. The Tiger achieved its hits at 100 yards range, close enough to penetrate the Pershing's turret through weak points. At such close range, even Sherman's 76mm guns could defeat Tiger armour from favourable angles. What the engagement demonstrated was that Pershings were not invulnerable, that German heavy tanks retained ability to destroy them, given opportunity, but that American heavy tanks could now survive hits that would catastrophically destroy Sherman's. Fireball's crew bailed out after the turret penetration killed 2 men. The tank itself remained mechanically functional except for the damaged gun barrel. Recovery crews retrieved it the same day. Ordnance personnel from the Zebra mission examined the damage, replaced the turret components, installed a new gun barrel, and returned Fireball to combat on March 7th, 11 days after the engagement. This rapid repair capability impressed German intelligence officers who reviewed reports from Elsdorf. German tank recovery and repair operations had deteriorated catastrophically by early 1945. Spare parts shortages, fuel scarcity for recovery vehicles, and Allied air attacks on repair facilities meant that German tanks suffering even minor damage often had to be abandoned. A Panther with a broken final drive that could be repaired in a field workshop in 1943 sat abandoned in 1945 because no replacement final drives existed and no fuel was available to transport it to a depot-level repair facility. The fact that Americans could recover a heavily damaged Pershing, transport it to a field maintenance site, and return it to combat in 11 days demonstrated logistical capabilities Germany no longer possessed. Shortly after the Fireball engagement, another T-26E3 from the same company destroyed a Tiger and 2 Panzer IVs at Elsdorf. German unit records do not detail this engagement, suggesting the vehicles were abandoned or destroyed so quickly that crews never filed after action reports. This pattern repeated throughout March as the final American offensive gathered momentum. German vehicles appeared, engaged briefly, and disappeared from German unit rosters as destroyed, abandoned, or missing. The famous engagement at Cologne on March 6, 1945, provided the most dramatic demonstration of Pershing capabilities and was captured on film by Army Signal Corps cameramen. A Panther tank from an unidentified German unit was prowling through rubble-choked streets near Cologne Cathedral when it encountered a Sherman from Company A, 32nd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division. The Panther fired first, destroying the Sherman and killing 3 crew members. A T-26E3, commanded by Sergeant Bob Early, with Corporal Clarence Smoyer as gunner, moved up the street approximately 75 metres behind the destroyed Sherman. Smoyer, one of the most experienced gunners in the division with 15 tank kills to his credit since Normandy, identified the Panther and engaged. His first 90mm round penetrated the Panther's side armour. The second and third rounds followed within seconds. All 3 penetrated completely, the side hits passing through the vehicle and exiting the opposite side. The Panther burst into flames. 2 of 5 crew members escaped. The others burned to death inside. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. Technical analysis of the destroyed Panther conducted after Cologne fell revealed that Smoyer's 3 rounds had penetrated at ranges and angles, where Sherman's 76mm guns would have achieved questionable results at best. The 90mm gun's superior muzzle velocity and projectile mass gave it substantial advantage over the Sherman's armament even when firing standard armor-piercing ammunition without specialized tungsten core rounds. German intelligence officers reviewing reports from Cologne recognized the implications immediately. American tankers now possessed a weapon that could engage Panthers and Tigers with confidence from frontal aspects at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. This eliminated the primary German advantage in armored warfare on the Western Front. Tiger and Panther crews had relied on their ability to destroy American tanks before American tanks could reply effectively. Panthers could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Shermans required close-range shots at flank or rear aspects to defeat Panther armor. This tactical asymmetry allowed heavily outnumbered German armored units to achieve favorable exchange ratios, despite overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The T-26E3 ended that asymmetry. Pershings could engage Panthers frontally at any tactical range, with reasonable probability of penetration and destruction. Panthers could penetrate Pershing armor frontally, only at closer ranges with careful shot placement. The firepower advantage had shifted to the Americans for the first time since German heavy tanks entered combat in late 1942. What German commanders understood, but could do nothing about, was that this shift occurred just as Germany's capacity to produce, maintain, and fuel heavy tanks collapsed completely. Even if Panthers and Tigers retained technical superiority in specific categories, Germany could no longer field them in numbers sufficient to affect outcomes. Fuel shortages, immobilized vehicles faster than enemy action destroyed them. Spare parts scarcity rendered minor mechanical failures catastrophic. Allied air power destroyed transportation networks, preventing movement of vehicles from factories to combat units. The Pershing arrived at the precise historical moment when its advantages mattered and its disadvantages did not. Yes, it was underpowered. Cross-country mobility was mediocre. Maximum speed was disappointing, but these limitations mattered little when German armored units were immobilized by empty fuel tanks and Allied air power dominated the battlefield. The Pershing's firepower and protection advantages mattered enormously when every tank engagement occurred at close range in towns and villages where German armor attempted desperate defensive stands. March 7, 1945, brought another critical Pershing engagement at Remagen during the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine. 4 T-26E3 tanks from Company A, 14th Tank Battalion, 9th Armored Division, provided fire support for the infantry assault that captured the bridge intact before German engineers could detonate demolition charges. The Pershings engaged German machine gun positions, anti-tank guns, and fortifications from positions on the west bank of the Rhine, their 90mm guns providing suppressive fire that enabled American infantry to cross the bridge. When American forces secured the East Bank bridgehead, the Pershings could not cross immediately. The Ludendorff Bridge, built in World War I for rail traffic, had been weakened by failed German demolition attempts and sustained combat damage. Engineers calculated that the bridge could not support the 46-ton weight of a Pershing without risk of catastrophic collapse. Shermans and lighter vehicles crossed immediately. The Pershings waited 5 days until engineers constructed barge ferries capable of transporting the heavy tanks across the Rhine. This incident revealed one of the few valid objections General Leslie McNair and Army Ground Forces had raised during debates over heavy tank production in 1943 and 44. European bridges and road infrastructure were not designed for vehicles weighing over 40 tons. American military engineers had to assess bridge capacity before allowing Pershings to cross. Some bridges simply could not support them, requiring detours or engineer construction of temporary bridges. These logistical complications never affected operations significantly because only 20 Pershings were deployed, but demonstrated genuine problems that would have emerged if Pershings had been deployed in larger numbers earlier in the campaign. For German commanders observing from defensive positions east of the Rhine, the Remagen crossing demonstrated American engineering capability and resource abundance that Germany could no longer match. Within 48 hours of capturing the bridge, American engineers had constructed multiple temporary bridges nearby, established ferry operations capable of moving heavy equipment, and built pontoon bridges upstream and downstream from Remagen. This engineering effort, supported by overwhelming anti-aircraft defenses that prevented Luftwaffe attacks from destroying the bridges, enabled American forces to pour troops and vehicles across the Rhine faster than German forces could establish defensive positions. The handful of Pershings visible in the bridgehead represented harbingers of what American industry would produce if given time. If 20 tanks mounting 90mm guns had reached combat in March 1945, how many hundreds would deploy by summer? How many thousands by autumn if the war continued? German intelligence officers calculating American tank production capacity understood that if the T-26E3 entered full production at the rate Sherman's had been produced, American armored divisions would be entirely re-equipped with heavy tanks within months. These calculations became academic as Germany's military position collapsed through March and April 1945. But they informed German understanding of why resistance was ultimately futile. Even if every German tank was technically superior to its American counterpart, which was no longer true with the Pershing's introduction, American industry could produce overwhelming numbers, while German production withered under Allied bombing and raw material shortages. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. April 10th, 1945. The village of Eppchenrode, west of Nordhausen in central Germany, Staff Sergeant Joseph Matera's Sherman tank took a Panzerfaust hit that penetrated the right fuel tank, setting the vehicle ablaze. The crew bailed out. One man suffered severe burns but survived. That afternoon, 3 replacement tanks arrived from rear maintenance areas. 2 were Shermans. The third was something entirely different. The T-26E4, informally called the Super Pershing by soldiers who encountered it, mounted the T-15E 190mm gun in a modified turret. This gun was 73 calibers long compared to the standard M3's 53 calibers. The longer barrel and high-capacity chamber gave the T-15E one muzzle velocity of 1140 meters per second, firing HVAP ammunition 600 feet per second faster than the standard Pershing's gun. This performance approached the German 88mm KAGK-43 mounted on Tiger II heavy tanks. The single T-26E4 prototype had arrived in Europe in mid-March 1945, shipped specifically to test whether American forces needed even more powerful guns to defeat the heaviest German armor. Maintenance crews from the 3rd Armored Division had added improvised armor protection before sending it to combat. An 80mm plate salvaged from a destroyed Panther was welded to the gun mantlet. Additional plates were welded to the front glacis, creating crude, spaced armor. Large counterweights were added to the rear of the turret to balance the exceptionally long gun barrel. The result looked like something assembled from scrap metal rather than a factory-produced fighting vehicle. The gun's twin recuperators mounted above the barrel gave the turret roof a cluttered appearance. The welded-on Panther armor plates created irregular surfaces that made the tank instantly distinctive. American soldiers who saw it remarked that it looked like a Frankenstein monster built from pieces of German and American tanks, but specifications mattered more than appearance. The T-15E1 gun could penetrate 302 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters range firing HVAP ammunition. This was sufficient to defeat Tiger II frontal armor, something the standard 90mm gun could not accomplish reliably. Matera's crew received the Super Pershing as their replacement tank. Corporal John Irwin, the crew's gunner, was 19 years old and had dropped out of high school to enlist in 1944. He would later write a memoir describing his experiences, though his account would be disputed by historians examining German unit records from the period. On April 21, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division entered the city of Dessau at the junction of the Mulde and Elbe rivers. German forces defended the city with determination, despite overwhelming Allied superiority and the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. American tanks advanced cautiously through rubble-filled streets, alert for anti-tank weapons and concealed German armor. According to Irwin's later account, the Super Pershing encountered a German heavy tank in Dessau's streets. Irwin identified it as a Tiger II, based on its massive size and long gun barrel. The German tank fired first. The round struck the Super Pershing, but failed to penetrate, possibly deflected by the improvised additional armor. Matera, who habitually stood in the turret, hatch during combat despite the danger, ordered Irwin to return fire. The Super Pershing's first shot was high explosive rather than armor-piercing. It struck but failed to penetrate. A second shot, this time armor-piercing, struck the German tank's lower hull plate, penetrating and detonating stored ammunition. The turret blew off in a massive explosion. This engagement, as Irwin described it, became one of the most famous tank duels of World War II. It appeared to demonstrate that American engineering had finally produced a weapon capable of defeating Germany's heaviest armor frontally. The Super Pershing had apparently destroyed a Tiger II, the most heavily armored and powerfully armed tank Germany fielded in direct combat. However, post-war research by historians examining German records cast substantial doubt on Irwin's identification. The SS 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, the only Tiger II-equipped unit operating in the region, was documented to be 70 miles from Dessau on April 21st, fighting Soviet forces approaching Berlin from the east. No German records document any Tiger II losses at Dessau. German unit records, remarkably complete even in the war's final chaotic weeks, show no Tiger II tanks anywhere near Dessau when the engagement occurred. Modern historians, including Stephen Zaloga, who has written extensively about late-war American and German armor, concluded that the vehicle destroyed at Dessau was most likely a Panzer IV. Tank identification in combat was notoriously difficult. American tank crews frequently misidentified German vehicles, particularly in urban combat, where visibility was limited and engagements occurred at close range. Panzer IVs, with their long 75mm guns, could be mistaken for Tigers by inexperienced crews under combat stress. The massive explosion Irwin described could result from ammunition detonation in any tank, not just a Tiger II. The distinction matters for understanding what German commanders and intelligence officers learned about American tank capabilities in the war's final weeks. If the Super Pershing had actually destroyed a Tiger II, it would have demonstrated that American engineering had achieved parity with Germany's most advanced armor. The actual engagement, destroying a Panzer IV at close range, demonstrated something different but equally important. American industry had fielded a tank with massive firepower overkill against medium German armor, suggesting that if the war continued, American heavy tanks would dominate any battlefield. Between April 4th and April 21st, the Super Pershing engaged and destroyed at least 3 German armoured vehicles. The first, destroyed near the Weser River, was identified as a tank or self-propelled gun at 1,500 metres range. It was possibly a Jagdpanther from the 507th Heavy Panzer Battalion, though positive identification was impossible at that distance. The second was destroyed on April 12th, again at long range with vehicle type unconfirmed. The third was the Dessau engagement on April 21st. Regardless of specific vehicle types destroyed, the Super Pershing's combat performance impressed American ordnance officers observing its employment. The T-15E1 gun proved exceptionally accurate at long range. Crew reports noted minimal recoil despite the weapon's high muzzle velocity, suggesting the recoil system functioned properly. The improvised additional armor, though adding weight and reducing mobility, apparently provided protection against at least one German hit that might otherwise have penetrated. German intelligence officers reviewing reports from units that encountered the Super Pershing recognized what it represented even without capturing an example for detailed testing. The vehicle demonstrated that American ordnance development continued, pushing toward heavier armament and thicker armor, following the same developmental path Germany had pursued since 1942. More importantly, it demonstrated American willingness to field experimental vehicles in combat to gather real-world performance data, something Germany had done extensively with Tigers, Panthers, and various other late-war designs. The critical difference, which German intelligence assessments noted explicitly, was that America could afford to experiment with single prototype vehicles while simultaneously producing thousands of standard tanks. Germany had been forced to rush incomplete designs into mass production out of desperation, creating vehicles like early Panthers that suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. America could deploy a single Super Pershing to test concepts, while Fisher Tank Arsenal and Detroit Tank Arsenal produced hundreds of standard Pershings monthly. By late April 1945, as the 3rd Armoured Division advanced deeper into central Germany, German resistance was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet forces fought through Berlin's suburbs. British and Canadian forces liberated northern Germany and the Netherlands. American forces advanced east to link up with Soviet units along the Elbe River. The few operational German armoured units remaining fought desperate delaying actions or attempted to surrender to Western forces rather than face Soviet captivity. In this context, individual tank engagements and technical assessments of specific vehicles became increasingly irrelevant. Germany's military defeat was inevitable, regardless of tank specifications. But German tank officers and engineers, watching their nation's final collapse, drew conclusions about why Germany had lost the armoured warfare competition that would influence post-war tank development. The Pershing, whether standard or super variant, had arrived too late to affect World War II's outcome, but early enough to teach critical lessons. German officers recognized that the Tiger's fearsome reputation and genuine tactical superiority had been rendered meaningless by Germany's inability to produce, maintain, and fuel enough Tigers to matter strategically. A few hundred Tigers scattered across multiple fronts could not stop thousands of Sherman tanks supported by overwhelming Allied air power and artillery. The Pershing demonstrated the opposite approach. American industry fielded a tank that was good enough in firepower and protection to fight German heavy armor while maintaining reliability, production volume, and logistical sustainability that Germany never achieved. The 90mm gun was not quite equal to the Tiger II's 88mm Kabuki-43, but it was close enough that the difference mattered little in practical combat. The Pershing's armor was not quite as thick as the Tiger's, but it was sufficient to survive most German anti-tank weapons at typical engagement ranges. Most critically, the Pershing existed in quantities sufficient to equip entire battalions and divisions. By war's end, 310 Pershings had reached Europe, with 200 delivered to frontline units. Production was accelerating, with plans to eventually replace all Shermans with Pershings or similar heavy tanks. If the war had continued into summer or autumn of 1945, American armored divisions would have been entirely re-equipped with heavy tanks mounting 90mm guns. Germany's tank development program had pursued excellence in individual vehicle capability at the expense of production volume, reliability, and logistical sustainability. America's program had pursued sufficient capability in vehicles that could be mass-produced reliably and sustained logistically across oceans and continents. The war's outcome validated the American approach decisively. German tank officers captured in the war's final weeks provided surprisingly candid assessments when interrogated by Allied intelligence. They acknowledged that German heavy tanks possessed superior firepower and armor protection compared to most Allied tanks. They admitted this superiority had proven tactically meaningless because German armored units were immobilized by fuel shortages more often than defeated by Allied tanks. They recognized that American industrial capacity had overwhelmed German technical sophistication through sheer production volume combined with adequate vehicle capability. One Panzer officer, interviewed by American intelligence in May 1945, summarized the situation bluntly. He stated that Tigers were magnificent tanks when they had fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. But Germany could not provide these essentials consistently after mid-1944. American tanks might be individually inferior, he continued, but they always had fuel, always had ammunition, always had spare parts, and could be replaced when destroyed. A Sherman that reached the battlefield and fought effectively was infinitely more valuable than a Tiger that sat immobilized 50 kilometers away, waiting for fuel that never arrived. The appearance of the Pershing in the war's final months demonstrated to German tank officers that America had finally addressed the Sherman's firepower limitations. If Pershings had been deployed in larger numbers earlier, the officer noted, German armored resistance would have collapsed even more rapidly than it did. The fact that only 20 Pershings saw combat suggested American confidence that even Shermans were adequate to defeat German forces, given overwhelming numerical and logistical advantages. This assessment, while painful for German pride, was essentially accurate. The United States had not needed to rush heavy tank production because Shermans, despite their limitations, were adequate to win when supported by massive artillery, complete air superiority, and unlimited logistics. The Pershing was developed and deployed more as insurance against the possibility that German tank development might produce something even more formidable than the Tiger II, than out of urgent necessity to replace the Sherman immediately. German post-war tank development, when West Germany rearmed in the 1952 as part of NATO, reflected lessons learned from the Pershing's approach rather than attempting to recreate Tiger or Panther capabilities. The Leopard 1 main battle tank, developed in the late 1952 and entering service in 1965, emphasized mobility, reliability, and maintainability over maximum armor protection and firepower. Its designers consciously chose not to pursue the heaviest possible armor or most powerful possible gun, instead creating a tank that could be produced in quantity, maintained by conscript soldiers with basic training, and sustained logistically by an army operating far from home bases. The Leopard 1 reflected German recognition that the Tiger's approach, magnificent in individual vehicle capability, had proven strategically bankrupt. Modern armored warfare required tanks that worked reliably, could be produced in adequate numbers, and could be maintained and supplied in the field. These were precisely the characteristics that made the Pershing significant, despite its late arrival and limited combat deployment. American tank development after World War II built directly on the Pershing's foundation. The M46 Patton, essentially an improved Pershing with more powerful engine and better transmission, entered service in 1949. The M47 Patton followed in the early 1952. The M48 Patton, which saw extensive service in Vietnam, represented evolutionary refinement of the Pershing's basic design. The M60 series, America's primary battle tank through the 1982, was a direct descendant of the Pershing design philosophy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any. Upload from us.